tehnoloogiaga tegeletakse, ma ütlen kõigile tere. Eesti Meremuuseumi poolt, minu nimi on Helene, kas tahapoole on kosta mind? Väga hea. I will continue in English because today's speaker is from Norway, Geir Kløver from Fram Museum from Oslo. He's the director of this museum and he knows really more about Amundsen than we all combined together. But there are some skeptics in the room, so we're going to have very good questions in the end. That's good. But to start his lecture about Amundsen and, let's say, his secrets to his success, I will give the microphone to Norwegian ambassador, Dag Finn Sørli.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I must admit I had to pause and touch my heart when I saw the tent out here with the Norwegian flag on the South Pole. It brought back memories from the childhood because growing up in Norway, you cannot avoid the stories about the great explorers, Amundsen, Nansen, Thor Heyerdahl, and others. And for a kid growing up, these were, of course, tales of excitement, of adventure. But of course, these trips by Amundsen and others, they were more than just adventures. They were also about research, exploring sides of this planet that we know today is absolutely essential to the health of this planet and to the future of mankind. And we also know today that both the southern and northern polar regions are under a lot of strain, a lot of pressure from human activity. So 100 years and a little bit more since Amundsen's victory over the British Scot in chasing towards the South Pole, we know that this is bloody serious. It's much more than just adventure. What I also learned out here was something I didn't know. Estonia and Antarctica. And you're not only claiming that you invented Skype, but you're claiming that you also found Antarctica. That's next thing is, I guess, you claim that you found America. But anyway, a fascinating story about a small nation like Estonia and its adventurous people. Let me also mention that Norway and Estonia are actually cooperating in polar research. We do cooperate when it comes to take down signals and data from satellites in Spitsbergen. There's also a common research program on mushrooms in the Arctic mushrooms. And of course, Estonians know a lot about mushrooms. We know a lot about Arctic, so I guess that's a good partnership. Congratulations to the museum for taking this, inviting us to this brilliant exhibition that supplements so brilliantly the rest of the permanent exhibition here. And I'm looking very much forward to listen to Director Kløver. Thank you.
Just before we start, if anyone is out of place, there are some free places here. So I see some people standing back there. There are free spots here, and it is better vision from here. Okay, it's your choice. I'm really honored to give the microphone to start the lecture series of Race to the End of the Earth exhibition, Mereforum, our very first lecture, and to give the microphone to Geir.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak on one of my favorite topics. In this lecture, I'm going to tell you why Amundsen got first to the South Pole. So, on the way to the South Pole, he done a lot of preparation in his childhood and his youth, but also on a 3-year-long expedition through the Northwest Passage, where he learned a lot of the things that he executed when he went to Antarctica. A lot of this material could for many people be very new material, because both some of the photos and also some of the information is from the personal diaries of the explorers, not only Amundsen, but also the diaries of his men. So in 2011, when we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the South Pole, the Fram Museum published the diaries of 15 of the 19 men that went to the South Pole. So we then had the story told from 15 different angles, which was quite a revelation. And some of these diaries have never been seen before. Even famous authors and biographers had never had access to do these diaries, and the families only submitted them to the museum when they saw how well we did some of the other diaries. They are being published in English eventually. It's a lot of work, but Amundsen's diary in itself in English has been published, and this week it's being published in German as well. Some of the key material in this presentation is from Amundsen's diary from his 3 years through the Northwest Passage. That was published earlier this year, and is coming in English next year. That's probably one of the nicest readings in my 10 years at the Fram Museum. It's so interesting, and I hope you will be interested as well after you've heard what I'm going to talk about. Amundsen was born in 1872, and through most of his young life he wanted to be a polar explorer, and he read all the stories from earlier expeditions. He hardened his body, but coming from a naval family, a maritime family, his mother, very determined mother, decided that since all the others are sailors, you're going to be a medical doctor. So he started to study then medicine, but halfway through his medical studies, his mother died. He threw away the medical books and went wholeheartedly into the study of polar exploration. Some of his earlier idols were the Norwegian explorer Fridtjof Nansen, who went on the expedition on the Fram across the Polar Sea, but also the expedition of John Franklin, the British explorer that disappeared with his 2 ships, Erebus and the Terror, trying to locate the Northwest Passage in 1845. And here you see some of the illustrations from the earlier attempts to find the Northwest Passage. For 400 years, all the big maritime nations on the world tried to locate the Northwest Passage, who was then seen as the shortcut to the Orient. Already 5 years after Columbus, they tried to find a shorter way. Of course, that ended in a lot of cold, death, and misery up in the Arctic waters, what is now belongs to Canada. In the end, people were quite tired of the Arctic exploration, and several of the countries gave up. There you see some images from the British press and what they considered what was up in the Arctic. But Amundsen was determined, and to gain experience, he noticed from a lot of the accounts of earlier explorers that some of them ended in mutiny and even murder because of divided leadership. You know, on an expedition there was a commander that wanted to find new territories, find new land and bays and islands to name in king and country, and there was a scientific responsible who wanted to find new species of everything, and it was the captain on board who didn't want to go anywhere. He wanted to keep safe his men and his crew, and the ship should be safe. And some of the earlier struggles on earlier expedition ended with struggles between these 3 people. And Amundsen then decided, when I go on an expedition, I will have all those responsibilities. I'll be the commander and owning the expedition. I'll be the captain on board. I'll also be responsible for the scientific results of the expedition. So the first thing is to sign up as a sailor on the Belgian Antarctic expedition from 1897 to 99, an expedition filled with inexperienced people wanting to do some early explorations of Antarctica. There was one experienced man on board, Frederick Cook, an American doctor who had experience from the Arctic. Before the expedition left Antwerp in Belgium, Amundsen was already first mate on the ship. And he had also previously some experience from the Arctic. The expedition didn't go very well at all. Based on curiosity, the commander led the ship closer and closer and later into Antarctica, and suddenly they were frozen in without equipment or clothing or food to spend the winter in Antarctica. It ended with 2 people dead, few went mad, and most people got scurvy. There was wind, there were hurricanes, but during all this process, Amundsen learned from the scientist, from the American doctor, Cook, and also spending every time to learn about Antarctica. Here you see from his diary some of his drawings. He tried what was best for skis, like short skis, long skis, 1-man, 2-man, 3-man sleeping bag. What type of angle should you have on the tent when it's blowing? He also tried to eat everything in the sea and on land that was possible to eat to see if it tasted good or had nutritional value. Some of the other on board made a joke about his attempts, and here they have a drawing of his 3-man sleeping bag. You have the captain with his hair sticking up on the right, and then the cook to the left and Amundsen to the right. After 2 years in Antarctica, Amundsen came back to Norway, knowing a lot about the Arctic conditions. And a lot of people do not know that when Amundsen returns 10 years later to Antarctica, he already spent the winter there in the most horrible condition which is possible. Of course, a great advantage for his next expedition. Of course, we all know that he sailed through the Northwest Passage and was the first man and the first crew on one ship that passed through the Northwest Passage, the so-called shortcut between the Atlantic and the Pacific. He spent 3 years doing so, and to get there, he bought his ship only 70 feet, the Gjøa. It was made the same year as Amundsen was born, 1872, and had been used on transportation between the north and south of Norway, also for fishing and sealing up in the Arctic. It's very small, but Amundsen wanted a small ship, a shallow ship, because he knew from all these other expeditions that it was not deep water. And while the British had larger and larger ships and stronger ships, Amundsen wanted a very small ship for shallow waters and also a very small crew. In case something goes wrong, if your ship sinks, to survive, you have to have few people so you can find sustenance in a very barren land. There were originally 8 people, but one cancelled of some reasons, maybe family reasons, but they went in June 1903, 7 people went towards the Northwest Passage. After a few months, they came to the King William Island, or King William Land as it was called at the time, and they settled camp and in a bay called Peterson Bay, and they name their bay Gjøa Haven, so the home of the Gjøa. And Amundsen decided, here we're going to spend 2 years. We're going to study the area and conduct magnetic research. Because doing the Northwest Passage was not a proper goal at the time, and especially if we wanted the support of Fridtjof Nansen, the famous Norwegian explorer, you need a scientific alibi. And for Amundsen, the goal was to relocate the magnetic North Pole. It had been discovered 70 years earlier, but all sailors knew that this magnetic pole has to move because of the deviation between compass and maps every year. they had to adapt the maps to fit with the magnetism, but nobody had proved it. It was discovered 70 years earlier by James Clark Ross, one of the earlier explorers in Antarctica, but Amundsen went now with scientific equipment. He'd spent several months with the leading scientist on Earth magnetism, Professor Neumeier in Hamburg. So he was well equipped, had Nansen's blessing, had the ship filled with magnetic instruments, and this is where they wanted to do the research. They set up their camp, and after a few months they meet the first Inuit. And that changed for Amundsen the whole expedition. So not only were they doing scientific research and measurement of the magnetism and every other scientific field in the area, but he also became an ethnograph student of the Netselik Inuit, one of the tribes in northern Canada that had never met white people. And Amundsen had brought with him things that he thought the Inuit would need. He also brought what existed of Inuit dictionaries to have a dialogue with these people. So while Franklin brought the Royal Marines with their fancy uniform and brass buttons and their guns, Amundsen brought needles and knives, dictionaries and cookware that there was not much of in this area. Already the next day, Amundsen leave with the Inuit back to their camp. This is a nomadic people. Have never seen white people before, as I mentioned. And during those 2 years, Amundsen collected every item of different kind that this community had, even kayaks, canoes, kitchen utensils, clothing and weapons, everything is now stored in the Fram Museum, and the Ethnographic Museum in Oslo is an amazing time capsule of this community, because they were nomadic people. They didn't save things. Objects was used until they didn't work anymore, and when people were buried, they were buried on top of the land with their personal equipment with them. So this equipment doesn't exist. So without Amundsen's collection, we would not have had example of this culture today. What was very interesting is these two items. This is knives that the Inuit had, and one of them is a British officer's saber. And the one below is a knife with the stamp Sheffield on it. So obviously they've had found graves, they found probably the ship of Franklin a couple of generations before, and now they have adapted this type of tools, using it to their own. But there was no stories among these Inuits, none of them, they just inherited from family members and so on. But of course there was a story of one ship that sank and a lot of hungry people. Here you see some of the magnetic research papers. They had a 24-hour automatic readers that went on long sledging campaigns, and they tried to box in the magnetic North Pole. So when they used these magnetic instruments with a magnet pointing down, so they needed to go on each side of what they considered the pole and having the magnet pointing inwards. Then they were feeling that they had been to the vicinity of the magnetic North Pole. And they found that it has moved about 70 kilometers the last 70 years. But they also found out that it could move up to 30 kilometers every single day based on the northern lights and other variations. So during these 19 months they spent in Johaven under extremely difficult conditions, they made a tremendous piece of research that was not much studied until very recently. And now scientists find out, based on those readings, they find findings that they didn't know about that happened at that time, like huge explosions on the sun that only they have recently charted. They also know now which date it happened 110 years ago based on this information. But going into the practicality of being an explorer, a lot of you know about Amundsen's dogs. My God, he ate his dogs. And of course, being in the north, the Inuit used dogs. Nansen tried to use dogs. The Norwegian Sverdrup on the second Fram expedition used dogs. So they knew they needed dogs and they needed to know how to use them. So they brought with them quite a few dogs, but all of them died of some specific disease and probably the wrong diet. They gave them dried fish, of course, which is not very, has nutrition in it, but it has no fat. And so Amundsen knew that you need a lot of dogs to make sure that you have enough when you're going on an expedition. But he also found out that Greenland dogs are more than happy to eat their comrades when you shoot them or when they're worn and they cannot pull anymore. You can then chop the dog up and feed the other dogs. He found out later on this expedition when they had Alaskan dog, an Alaskan husky refused to eat an Alaskan husky. So then, for all expeditions then, Amundsen need Greenland dogs. Then you have nutrition on 4 legs to use in case of emergencies. As you see here on this photo, and you're up in an area where it's very difficult to navigate, and especially in between winter and summer, everything looks the same. It's completely flat, and also the landscape, and it's clouds and sky and snow and lakes, everything looks the same. It's like a white wall. And the dogs refuse to go in those areas unless there was one person in front. And you see here the wife of the Inuit is running in front of the dogs, otherwise the dogs would not move. So Amundsen then, for his South Pole expedition later, hired the best skier in Norway as a front runner, a 50-kilometer winner from Holmenkollen, Olav Bjørland, who would love to go to the North Pole, who was then the plan. And also on this expedition, in extreme cold, they discovered that the fuel vaporized from cans. When it's down to 40 or 50 degrees, the metal shrinks and paraffin leaks out. And you're coming to a depot, you're starving and you're thirsty, especially thirsty, and your life depends on the paraffin. Without the paraffin, you cannot make water. Without water, you die. So, and that was physical, tough when you discover that, come to a depot after 3 months, you're not too far from the Gjøa and the Gjøa harbor, and it's only half full container of paraffin in the depot, which of course change all plans. Then you can't do further exploration. You have to go back to the ship as soon as possible to make sure that you have metal, fuel. And as you probably know, when snow is extremely cold, it's like sand. And to get the sledges to run in this sand, the Inuit, they had water in their polar bear mittens and made thin layers on the runners. So when you have an ice layer on the runners, like the runners didn't even have to be very polished, it slid very well on the snow. Also an important lesson. But also a very important lesson that Amundsen was so tired. You got up 4 to 5 in the morning, it's 40 degrees cold, and then you have to pack your tent, you have to strap, put everything in boxes, strap the sledges with the frozen ropes. It's a terrible thing. And sometimes they could not start the sledge voyage on the day until 9 o'clock. They spent 4 hours packing. For Amundsen, that was a complete waste of time. It drained your energy, but also when you do this, working with your fingers and hand, you get cold. You start already the day in a bad condition when you have to do so much work before you go. And the clothing. After just a few months, and Amundsen changed into full Inuit clothing. They had the reindeer underwear with hair in. And then they had reindeer outerwear with the hair out. And as a Norwegian being skiing, you know, and you put your reindeer skin under your butt in the snow and you stand up and half the hair is sticking in your pants. You know, that's not good if you have underwear like that. It will scratch a lot. But the Inuit knew how to do it because they kill the animals in September and they skin them and they leave the fur in the snow over the winter, and then they start to chew it, and then the first season they use it for like a blanket, and after a season of blanket they start to use it to make clothing, so no hair were lost, and with the hair in it's never dirty, and it's always refresh, you know, it's air. They had wide, the 2 layers of the reindeer, they wore them wide, and if you see on their clothing, their tail looked like a tuxedo, and it looked very strange. And then the Norwegians laughed in the beginning, but didn't think more about it. Later on the expedition, when Amundsen is telling the story, he need to go 1,500 kilometers on ski to find the closest telegram station, and he into Alaska, and then he met Indians, American Indians, and they laughed at Amundsen with his strange tail. So, you know, it's just a human, so he cut it off. And instantly it was much colder. So this tail hanging back, and you move forward, helps circulation inside the clothing, making sure that you don't sweat as much as it would have. And if you go to any sports store and look at the winter anoraks, have you noticed they're becoming longer and longer in the back? When I grew up in the 70s, it was all straight, front and back, and now it's 10 centimeters difference between back and front. So these are things that they found out. And all his clothing, including boots, hood, everything you can wear for 50 minus 50, weighed 2 kilos. Everything you wore, gloves, shoes, hats, coat, 2 kilos. And of course, loose and 2 kilos gives you a huge advantage when you move, and when you move far, which of course Amundsen did later. Fresh food, always get fresh food when it's available. All these animals are seasonal, so you can't plan to go out in the afternoon to kill something to have for dinner. Reindeers are there only for a time. Salmon are there only for a time. You have to stock up when it's available. And Amundsen brought a lot of tin cans with nutritional food, but that was not good enough. It was too salty and was not fresh. So when Amundsen did his long expedition with the dogs to find the magnetic North Pole, he brought with him these tin cans, and after 2 months he had traces of scurvy, lack of vitamin, and when he put his thumb into his thigh, it took hours before that bump came out, so he was sick, and he understood that it was the canned food, and they tried to find fresh food. They got back, got fresh food, and after a few weeks he was back in business. But to be totally dependent on tinned and canned food that you bring from home is a very bad idea. So when you get food, and lots of it, make sure you kill it there and then so you have storage. And also that you can't bring all this food with you. You need to spread it out in the direction you're going, and use a lot of efforts and to make that you can move from food storage to food storage that help to go further distances. And adapt to the weather and landscape all the time. They learn to build igloos. A thin tent is not good in minus 50. So even on the South Pole expedition, when they went to extreme coldness, they set up an igloo in Antarctica, and it took a long time. You know, the Inuit can put up an igloo just like that. The Norwegians probably built 100 igloos over the whole area before they managed the process of making sure it was not good. But there's so many details, there's so much of the Inuit and how they live and how they found their way and how they used the equipment and how they made it in Amundsen's diary, so I'll not go through this then, but there was a lot of life essential lessons when they lived with the Inuit. And what's interesting is that it's so detailed, this diary, so they had to be speaking the language. So it's very clear that the Netsilik Inuit communicated everything to them, and they wrote it down and could tell about it. So 2 years ago, when I'm discussing this diary with the mayor of Haven today, he couldn't understand this level of knowledge, which is not written anywhere. You know, the names of the 13 months of the year, why this month is called exactly that, etc., etc., about ritual suicide, which they will never tell any white man today, and how they killed family members if you're not able to move anymore. Like if you've broken a leg, you know, you couldn't move from the next place to next place, then that person will kill himself by leaning. They strap a line inside the igloo, and they would lean the neck over this line and used all their power to destroy the neck, so they couldn't get air. But if they were not strong enough to do this, the family member will help them, because to carry family members with them would be death for all of them. You know, they didn't have that opportunity. So all this knowledge had to mean that they were very vocal and very personal, and also know each other's language. And of course, with the white and flat landscape, it's impossible to get an overview. The Earth is circular, probably still, and with the ship and the mast is not very long, so you have to find a way to get a better view than from the top of a mast, especially if you go into icy conditions. Very important lesson, that everything breaks. Everything. The machine blows up, the mast breaks, scientific instruments go to pieces, guns blow up in their face, etc. You need people that can fix everything. You need the raw material with you to fix everything. But you can't bring with you 50 people. So you have to have people that can do a lot of stuff. So you needed people that had almost 3-4 careers and 3-4 expertise, so you can divide these expertises on a smaller crew. Here you see some of their trades. Amundsen bought everything, as I mentioned, clothing and so on, and he paid with metal, which they love, and also needles, matches, and cooking, kettles, that type of things. Here you see a picture of them in the Inuit clothing in the aft saloon of the Gjøa. Here's a photo of him, Amundsen, in Eagle City. So he went 2,600 kilometers to tell the story that he's been through the Northwest Passage. He goes to Eagle City, and then he sends a telegram, and with a secret message, because it's in plain Norwegian language, to Nansen, who was then sending it to a British magazine that have bought the rights to his story for a lot of money. But on their way through Minnesota, where a lot of Norwegians live, Postal Major Glassford thought this was so interesting, so leaked it to American papers. So they knew all about it in America before they got the news in Norway and England, and Amundsen lost all the money. So he were not able to honor the agreement, so they didn't pay this huge amount of money, which was a very costly lesson for him. But now he then waited in Eagle City for several months until all his crew members have gotten letters and parcels from home before he went back to the ship and continued the expedition. Of course, the importance of Norway then being an independent nation, and how the king and queen was the most important information. When they left, we were in a union with Sweden. When he came to Eagle City, we're an independent country. And Amundsen was so proud that from then on, June 7 was the national day. Forget about May 17, the day of Constitution. June 7 is the most important day, and he continued to celebrate that. They also continued to celebrate May 17, which is our national day, but that was because the cook Lindström's, that's his birthday. They got to Nome in August 1906, and then they sailed down to San Francisco just after the earthquake in San Francisco. But still, the people of San Francisco thought this was amazing. They heard about attempts to find the Northwest Passage all their lives, and here they are, finally, after 400 years, a small ship and a group of 7 Norwegians. So Amundsen was celebrated hugely for weeks, even in a very disturbed San Francisco. They even gave him a huge trophy in recognition of one of the greatest achievements chronicled in the history of the world. So a bit over the top in San Francisco, but it's such an interesting expedition and such an important expedition for Norway at the time. And in Norway it's mostly forgotten. At least now we have a whole new building in our museum telling these stories. The Geir was put on shore in San Francisco until 1972, when it returned to Norway, and it was outside belonging to another museum until 2009, where we asked to get it and worked hard to get ownership of the ship. And in 2030 we could open a whole new building for this important vessel. Amundsen would then tour the world, receiving honors everywhere, doing lectures everywhere, and at the same time he's planning his expedition. Nansen on the Fram never made it to the North Pole, and at the time in 1896 the instruments, like no scientist wanted to be part of it because it was too dangerous, and the scientific instruments were not that great, so Amundsen wanted to repeat Nansen's voyage across the polar sea with a ship filled with instruments and scientists. And while he is working on this, there's, with 2 weeks, 1 week in between, 2 Americans, Robert Peary and Frederick Cook, claims to have been to the North Pole. And then everything changed, because no one wants to pay for a lecture or a book about the third man to the North Pole. So the money is gone. No sponsors want to put money into this adventure, but still it was a hugely important scientific expedition. So the Norwegian government put money on it, Nansen put money on it, but if that would continue, Amundsen would be personally bankrupt, so he needed a different goal. So he decides, I'll go to the South Pole on the way to the North Pole. So he don't inform many people, the captain of the ship, and also a scientist, friend of Nansen. He starts planning about going to the south. None of the crew knows about this venture at all. Here you have a picture from some of Amundsen's preparations. He wanted to be higher than the masts. We heard about earlier balloon attempts that didn't work for Scott on his first Antarctic expedition. So he had to find a way to get high up, and they tried these man-lifting kites. These kites got up to 600 meters or 150 meters with a man hanging under this kite, and it was finishing this testing and was packing the equipment on board when the lightning strike, and the captain of the Fram is killed instantly because he was holding this steel wire when the lightning struck. So they skipped further testing and hired a new captain, even if the second mate, Gjertsen, volunteered to continue this important testing. So, we're ready. Going on a new expedition. It's a few years since Amundsen returned from the Northwest Passage. He's a hero a lot of places in the Western world. He's a star in Norway, and this time a lot of people want to be part of an expedition to the north. And here I'll tell a little bit about the men that joined the expedition. Helmer Hansen had been with Amundsen 3 years in the Northwest Passage, and later was captain on his later ship, the Maud, very experienced. Sverre Hassel, he'd been 4 years on the Fram, driving dogs in Arctic Canada with the Fram expedition, so also very experienced. And Olav Bjørland, the 50-kilometer winner at Holmenkollen, also a ski maker and an excellent carpenter. The officers were all from the Navy. Every expedition, Amundsen got his main crew from the Navy and the officers because he thought they had the best navigation education that money could buy. So all the captain, first and second mate were Navy officers. Very interesting diaries, all of them. Gjertsen was one of the first people to be recruited. He was the best pupil at the Navy Academy. He was so good at school. When the Queen Maud of Norway was coronated, he held her veil as a student at the cathedral in Trondheim. He was also sent, because if you have a doctor in Amundsen's mind, you get sick. So he didn't want a doctor, but he sent Gjertsen to a 2-week amputation and tooth pulling class at the hospital in Oslo. He didn't need the amputation, but the tooth pulling are vividly described in some of the diaries. Thorvald Nilsen was an amazing captain, and it's in his diary later when Fram moves north and along the South American coast. They are getting food and getting ready to go to San Francisco to start a northern expedition, and they had to wait for a long time, and all the food rottens, and there's billions, millions of beetles and larvae all over the ship, like even in the personal cabins, and it smells like hell. And Nilsen refuses the crew to throw this poisonous food over the side because it's too close to the sea, and there were villagers living along the coast, so they spent several days heading out to open sea before he allowed them to throw this torture of smell and everything out of the ship. So quite special 100 years ago, thinking of poor population and the environment. The engineers, extremely important when you're crossing the globe in a ship, and Amundsen needed a better engine than a steam engine, so he put in a diesel engine, the first diesel engine ever to be put in an ocean-going vessel. So in 1910, he put in a diesel from Stockholm, diesel AB, and in the beginning it was horrible. The engineers did not know how to deal with this machine. The pistons got stuck in the cylinders, the fuel was not calibrated right, etc. So after a test drive, the 2 main engineers were fired, and Amundsen demanded through the newspapers to get a proper engineers from the factory that built the engine. It caused very bad press for diesel just in their startup, and also going through the newspapers, Amundsen knew that he will get his man, and then the Diesel AB sends one of his best engineers to Norway, who then joined for the whole expedition, and even then signed up for a 6-year expedition after that, so he must have joined it. And then it worked perfectly, because diesel is much more efficient, it takes less space, and also better maneuverability of the engine, but it still took 25 years after the success of Amundsen diesel, because Norwegian shipping industry, one of the leading in the world, changed from steam into the better diesel. Same as slow when we moved from sailing to steam, you know. So that's quite interesting how these amateurs, looking through all facts available, and do something as drastic and changing the main component of a ship before such a dangerous expedition. So they ended up with these engineers, and it's interesting with Halvardus Christensen, the 3rd engineers. Most of the others, they wrote diaries. He wrote love letters. He sent letters to his fiancée for 2 years, letter after letter, several letters a week, he stored them up, and there's not a mention of ice or penguins or Buenos Aires or Montevideo or 97 dogs or Amundsen or his colleagues. It's just, I love you, I love you. And butterflies and flowers and bees and about fishing. So it's quite, where did he go? Like, he saw some of the most interesting things of the time, took part in an amazing historical experiment, and then no, that was not what he wrote about. Here is a lot of other crew members. Hjalmar Johansen, he's been with Nansen towards the north, very experienced, visiting from the Navy. Martin Rønne, older Navy guy, is making sleeping bags and tents and so on. And he writes in his diary that I've sailed with 21 captains and 8 admirals, and Amundsen is number 1. And it's quite interesting, when you read biographies in Norway about Amundsen, they want to make him into a crook, a kind of a tough, single-minded guy. While you write the biography of Nansen, and he's like Jesus, Mr. Perfect. And the more I read, the more I study, it's a bit closer to the opposite. Amundsen was an amazing leader. He implemented modern leadership theories 80 years before anyone else, and how he individually motivated each of his men. He could sit and sing old sailor songs with another one. He could help the dogs with a second one, and so on. And if you lost something, like that was important for you, you can bet on your birthday. It would be a brand new thing on your plate. And also when there's a birthday, was their favorite meals served. And he found that information and ordered cooks to make this. So it's, this is the reasons why we started to publish these diaries in the first place, to increase the credibility of biographies and historical stuff that is written. Oh well, little here about authors and biographers. Stubberud, carpenter, Hansen and Beck, they were also very experienced ice pilots from northern Norway. They started with the cooks. The cook, Sandvik, with the X, was not very popular with the men. He was angry, he got pissed off very easily, and he also made bread that was black on the outside and raw on the inside, so he was fired. And in the end, the cook Lindström, who had been 4 years on the Fram with Sverdrup and 3 years on the Gjøa with Amundsen, was then hired to be a chef also on this expedition. You have June 1910, and Fram is ready. Nansen here with Amundsen, waiting for the king and queen to say departure. The king and queen want to be part of it, but the queen's father, Edward VII, had just died in England, so they were there for official mourning, so they had to wait a few weeks before the king and queen returned to Norway, before they then could depart. And here you see their house. Like, you're going to the North Pole and you're bringing a house. The crew was just in shambles, and nobody said that if we're putting that house on the moving Arctic ice, I will definitely not stay there. But Amundsen said, oh, we use it for measurements and storage and these things, and nobody understood the use of this house. Here's Amundsen outside his house, just south of Oslo. It's a time capsule, and it's worth visiting. There's about 800 people that see this house every year, and if you go in there today, it's just like Amundsen died. His hat and cane is hanging out in the hallway. The bar of soap is still on the sink, etc. So it's a very nice historical place to visit, but that's another story. You have the ship moving south, and the first is Fram is doing an oceanographic test run around the British Isles before he went back to Norway. to test the scientific instrument to warm up the cruise, and then it goes down to Madeira. Because to go to the Arctic, you have to go south of Argentina and Chile, and then back up to San Francisco and into the sea from there. So nobody still had a clue on their original direction. And then they come to Madeira, they fill up the ship with fresh food, fresh water, and here is the logbook from the 9th of September in 1910. And I'll read the last 2 lines of that day. At 6 in the afternoon, it was announced that the expedition's plan was expanded to also include the South Polar area. Everyone agreed to go along. And then they had 1 hour to write letters to home about that they're not going to the north at all, they're going to the south, and maybe they'll be a bit longer before they return home. And they already signed up from 5 to 7 years. So here you have some of the celebrations and some of the activities on the way down. They're heading now to Antarctica directly from Madeira. So it took 4.5 months, and they didn't stop anywhere. Amundsen did not want to stop anywhere where he could be stopped. Because why didn't he tell anyone that he was heading south? And in the political perspective, Norway was 5 years old. Everyone knew that England wanted to conquer the South Pole. England is the godfather of Norway. The Queen is the daughter of the English king. England was one of the first countries to approve Norway as an independent country. Nansen is the Norwegian ambassador to London. The government would not want to embarrass the British, and Amundsen could not tell anyone. And he didn't stop anywhere on the way down, so it was completely a mystery. And of course, if he did, he would have been stopped. Both Nansen and the government would have stopped him, and then he would have been bankrupt. And someone else would have come to the South Pole. But here you see on the way down pictures from when you cross the equator. It's quite amazing to see the original film taken there where Gjertsen is dressed in a woman's dress. The captain is telling jokes and dancing New Orleans style. And a very important management tool for Amundsen is the record player, which he hid in his cabin, and only on the very important moments he went into his cabin, winded it up, and everyone is around the table, and these songs flows out. Could be Christmas Eve, could when someone is very depressive, missing his family, then he's doing this tear-jerking, those emotional songs that really motivated the crew. So it used them very seldom and only at the right moments. And of course, all the Norwegians were on the same deck. You know, if you're a crew or a captain, you all share the same table and you had an individual cabin, etc. Here you see the ship on the way down, because they have with them 97 dogs. They love it in the cold, Greenland dogs. And here they're in 40 degrees, crossing the equator and the Pacific. So they had to shelter the dogs on the way. And of course, dogs, they don't like movement. And Fram is made for the ice, not the sea. So the belly of the Fram is completely round. There's not a keel. So you don't go through the waves, you go the long way. Up and down, sideways, all the time. So during those 4.5 months, it was only 2 days they didn't have to tie the chairs to the legs of the table. And of course the dogs, when they hit another dog, they start to fight. You know, so in the beginning it was a lot of mess, and in the end they strapped the dogs at different places until they got used to it and they continue their voyage. Like even the mountain men of Norway had to be sailors in record time. Here you see the navigators. And attempt for fresh food. Amundsen's lesson, you have to get fresh food. They try with albatross. And in Amundsen's diary, it says, wonderful, albatross steak, tomorrow soup. And the next day, the soup was horrible. So then they gave up the albatross hunting for fresh food, but a few of them are still at the Zoological Museum in Oslo. Of course, with 97 dogs, there's dogs everywhere, and every man were responsible for a group of dogs, and the ones that were supposed to lead sledge teams had their teams already set with these dogs. But instead of getting to Antarctica with 50 dogs, as Amundsen had thought, based on his experience on Gjøa, 115 dogs arrived. And a lot more puppies were born, but all the female puppies had to be thrown overboard. Why? Because if a female dog gets in heat when you're on the route to the South Pole, the male dogs go nuts, completely crazy, and they just have to stop using dogs. There you see the dogs scattered everywhere, and the captain of the Fram is then on the top left with in charge of all the puppies. The dog on the bottom right, Isaac, the dog Isaac, broke his leg, and Gjertsen, who's then had his education, 2-week education, could mend the leg of this dog. Amundsen had talked to Shackleton and also other Antarctic explorers who knew exactly where he'd go through the barrier to get into the Ross Sea. So the Fram only spent 4 days going through this ring of ice around Antarctica. At the same time, Scott in Terra Nova spent 23 days. It's quite a big difference. And on the Terra Nova, you burned so much coal to get the ship through this barrier in 23 days. It's already there that Amundsen had an advantage over his British rival. Here you see the route to Antarctica and back. Nilsen, the captain, estimated that from Kristiansand in Norway, where they started, to the Bay of Whales, where they planned to start, it would be 16,000 nautical miles. It was 15,938, and they arrived 1 day before the schedule. So it's quite professional characters that they brought with them. And here you see the Fram in the Bay of Whales, which is actually the only place along the barrier where you can go ashore from. And that's because there's an island, which was then not discovered at the time, breaks up the ice, so making it the ice much lower. And through Borchgrevink, Norwegian explorers, and Shackleton, Amundsen knew about this place and headed directly there. You see the temporary camp, and they divided the 19 men in 2 teams. The 10 men that would remain on board the ship, they took everything off the ship, and the 9 men that were supposed to spend the winter in Antarctica, they transported all equipment to the wintering place, and also learning to use the dogs properly in this process. So you see they're moving goods from the Fram and into their wintering place, while the 10 men at the sea party, they took 60 tons of seal, which were there at the time. A few weeks later, they had already left for the season, so they had enough food for both the dogs and the crew for the next year. The Fram would then leave to Buenos Aires and conduct scientific and oceanographic research between Africa and South America before it was supposed to return to Bay of Whales and pick up Amundsen the next year. There's a picture of the Fram taken from the Terra Nova, Scott's ship. It's quite interesting to see the Fram from this angle. And Scott's men had dropped the main crew and Cape Evans on the Ross Island in the Ross Sea, and then we're looking for a place to go on top of the barrier and do research of an area called Edward VII Land, which was close to where Amundsen were. And there they see this ship. So not only was it rumor that Amundsen was heading south, also that he was this close, and also one grade closer to the South Pole than Scott was. And what's not very known that the English and the Norwegians had a great time together. They almost spent one day together, and of course the Norwegians were bragging about their professionals and their professionalism and how well it was to be an explorer under the Norwegian flag. And all of this is in both the English diaries and the Scottish diaries. But all these English diaries, when they were published, were censored because the Norwegians shouldn't be nice guys, that they loved the Fram and they had a good time, were removed from their diaries before publishing. So it's quite incredible that 80, 90 years after this, they could still not publish that the Norwegian and the English had a great time together. Fortunately, now some of these diaries has been bought and published by an Australian, like Levick, surgeon on the Terra Nova expeditions, talk about the Norskies and say, this is going to be the greatest race in history. He writes in his diary, and until a few years ago, nobody knew because it had been censored. So very, very strange. Here you see a photo of the Fram and the Terra Nova. Same here. And here, some of the English are meeting for pancake breakfast at Framheim, the Norwegian hut. And it's a strange thing, a strange tradition that the Norwegians are serving American pancakes every morning. And this has to do with the Northwest Passage expedition, because when Amundsen comes to Alaska, after being through the Northwest Passage, in one of these postal huts on the way to Eagle City, he served American pancakes for the first time in his life, and he says, this is the best thing I ever tasted. How can a normal breakfast happen after this? And from then on all his expeditions, for every breakfast, American pancakes. Simple as that. And the British were invited, and they compared notes, checked their watches, and so on. And Amundsen offered them to stay here, stay with our camp, and then you can do your research from here. But the English then, no, you have to go back to Cape Evans and tell Scott about Amundsen and the Norwegians, who looked very strong. And also, the Norwegians had to go up a hill with all the supplies from the Fram until the camp Framheim, and just to fool the English, they did some runs with empty boxes, and the dogs went like hell up this hill, and the Englishmen got really scared. And they asked about, oh, where is this Amundsen? We have a message to Amundsen, and then this big guy coming down the hill, and in getting close, just whistle, the dogs stop instantly, and he moves towards them, and that turns out to be Amundsen. So quite a good first impression. Here you see Framheim and how it was first planned. They built this hut, and everything was supposed to happen in that hut. All the work, every preparations. So it was organized so the beds could be lifted and the table could be lifted. So at least they had a place to work. And all the dogs, you see them outside, 115, strapped to a large steel wire. But it ended up, like, took only days before the hut was buried because of the snow drift. So they had to take a different plan. But first of all, they had to get food closer to the South Pole. So they went on 3 depot expeditions. Most men participated in all the expeditions, and got hundreds and hundreds of kilos of seal meat and other petroleum and other essential tools towards the South Pole. So at 80 and 81 and 82 degrees, they put up large depots. And as you see on this slide, that all the flags on each side of the depot, Amundsen's experience from the Northwest Passage was almost impossible to find the depots. Like compass don't work in the close to the magnetic North Pole, the snow and the sky all look the same. So to find back his depots, he went each direction, almost 10 miles, and put flags like a wall across from the depot. So you didn't only have to find the depot, he needed just to find one of these flags. And when you have such a broad wall, it would be impossible to miss. And in each of these flags was a piece of paper which stated which number it was and the direction to the depot. And also between the depots, they built cairns every day, and they used dried fish as markers, and like dogs could eat the dry fish on the way back. And also when they have finished with the boxes of food and so on, they smashed them and put these boxes also as markers on the way between the depots, which is important because then you don't have to spend so much time navigating. You can just follow your markers instead of waiting for the sun and the stars to find out where you are. So, Framheim, the hut, was almost snowed in, so they were tired of cleaning her out in the morning, getting the snow away from the door, so they dig down instead. So they built this whole village under the ice. So every man got his own studio, working place, under the ice that was chopped out of the hard-packed ice. And here you see each dog had a tent, like each dog team had a tent, and the tent had a cellar a bit 1.5 meters down, so the dogs couldn't destroy the tent with their claws. And they had steam bath, toilet, observatory, cold tents, etc. The bathroom, because from the Inuit, Amundsen learned that, you see this on the cartoons of an igloo, there's this tunnel on the way in. The Inuit also use that, and in the middle of it is a bit wider. That's where they go to the toilet, and then when they've done what they have to do, they let the dogs in, and then after a few minutes, you can't see traces of what you have been doing. And the same thing here, opening in the back. So once a while, they just let the dogs into the bathroom, and it was cleaned and ready for the next person. This is the meat tent. In the end, it had to be protected by barbed wire because every second day the dogs got meat, every second day the dogs got fish. And when there was fish, they didn't care. Every second day there were a big line and tried to rob the meat tent. And so in the end, they had to sneak the fish into the meat tent and then ring the bell and serve them fish from the meat tent. And here you see, after a while, you can hardly see the top of the hut and also the top of the tents. So imagine just being in there, very comfortable conditions, living under the ice while there's storm raging outside. So from the diaries and also some of the few photos that exist from this, we've made some scenes that we show in the museum of what happened, what each man were doing during the preparations. So here is Bjørland and Stubberud working on the sledges and cases. And the sledges weighed almost 70 kilos, and they were very stiff and rigid and were not usable at all. So after the depot expedition, I took them to pieces, and changed the wood, put them back together in a different structure, and now they weighed only 28 kilos and were much more flexible and better. And they had made packing boxes of ash. They were very heavy, they were 8 kilos and 1 centimeter thick. So Amundsen said after, we have to make them thinner and lighter. So they tried with a plane to make them thinner, but ash was too hard. So they had to use an axe and spend 3 months with an axe to then make 6 sides of 52 boxes thinner. And in the end, they've saved 3 kilos per box. That's 12 kilos per sledge. Maybe that's the margins you need on an expedition like that. Here they are working on the sewing different things. They started up with two 3-man tents. It was very light with 3-man tent, but you were 5 going. And then when you cooked in one tent and passed the food over to the other tent, not very smart at all. So they kind of remade the tents into a 5-man tent. They made another layer. They used the curtains in the hut to make another layer on top of the tent. So you had 2-layer tent, which means all the moist then gathered between the 2 layers and not inside the tent. Here he's sewing small bags of cloth, and in that cloth they put dried milk powder. And because when you work on pemmican, that was circular, the boxes, and you got rid of the tins, so you put the frozen pemmican in the boxes. It was it's a small hole, because they're not square. So to use that space, make it more compact, they made these stockings type things that fit exactly those holes. You can thread them between the pemmican and thus save a lot of space when you pack the sledges. Here's Johansen packing 56,000 biscuits. And here in these boxes, which are now thinner, there's 9 layers of biscuits, and in his notebook he writes Sledge 1, box 1, layer 1, 580 biscuits. And he keeps doing that for all type of food. So every sledge had their own book. So at every single moment on the expedition, by looking in this book, they knew exactly what was on each sledge and how much they eaten, how much it was left. And look at this lid. So it's not a normal lid. They made a small round hole that fitted the top of a milk pail. You know, a milk pail is circular. So they never had to pack or unpack the boxes. They were strapped permanently to the sledges, so they just could open this lid and take what they needed. So just by that movement, they saved probably at least 2 hours every single day, and they didn't have to get frozen on their fingers by packing and unpacking. And here they're strapping these boxes to the sledge using pork hides covered with zinc, because the dogs ate everything. There's bindings, their clothing, whatever was left outside the tent, the dog would eat. So they covered these pork hides with zinc so the dogs wouldn't eat it, and it was permanently strapped. So here you see this layer, like a trunk of a car, where they just could take what you want and go directly to the box on the sledge you needed based on these different diaries. Here you see inside there's the observatory, it's the coal and petrol storage, also inside hallways. It's probably taken about the same day in the Scots camp and the Framheim camp. And here you have all the 9 Norwegian, the only photo taken in Antarctica with all the Norwegian 9 men that stay there is the Midsummer Eve. And they use Christmas Eve as Midsummer Eve, the opposite, so to have parties and celebrations. And on the British photo, it's just the officers having celebration, because the crew, they're on the other side of the wall. They're not to mingle or eat together, or not even eating the different food. And so after the Norwegians, it's important on an expedition, you get up in the morning, you start a routine. It's a day's work, everyone was paid, so it was a tough program. You got up, you got dressed, and then you go out and feed the dogs. And then you go to your studio and put a primus on with a brick on top as an oven. And then you go in and eat yourself, and you do work until lunch. Then you have lunch, you work until dinner, and after dinner you work on your personal equipment. So everything was changed. The boots was remade 3 times. The anorak was remade and fixed on, so it was completely perfect and moved. And in the end they had to cancel Sundays because they did not have time to do all their individual preparation. So 6 months of evenings every single day, in the end also full Sundays, just to work on the clothing and the equipment that you plan for later in the year to ski, because they had some gambling, they played darts every evening for big prizes and so on. And Amundsen also had this competition that when you go out in the morning, you smell the air, you feel the temperature, and you come in and you sign in the book how cold you think it is. And then after everyone done that, they check it towards what the real temperature. In the end, they didn't need the temperature meter because everyone knew about how cold it was. And after half a year of this, he's doing all these strange small things. And through this, his men got better and better and prepared and prepared. Here's a photo of the steam bath. That's the New York Times. They thought it was curious that they had a steam bath when it's 60 degrees cold outside. But if you see, here you see how it works. You see all these famous current day polar explorers, you have ice in their hair, in their nose, everywhere there's a hole, there's ice sticking out. While Amundsen going 3,000 kilometers to the South Pole and back, and they're clean shaven. He said, we don't want ice in the beards and so on, you can get frostbites and so on. So every Saturday in camp, they had a bath and they shaved and were cleaned up. And even on the way to the pole and back, they shaved to make sure that they would not be so easy for them to get frostbites. Science had to be done, and this is Lindström doing science when the others are away. And here you see their clothing, exactly the same as Amundsen wore in the Northwest Passage. This is their clothing that they're also wearing towards the South Pole. But of course it was hard work, so 2 weeks before they get to the South Pole, they put caribou skins in the depot, and they walked the rest with just normal anoraks, because only it was minus 20, and for a few of them they didn't even have to take gloves, because they considered it warm. And a picture of Scott there with this clothing, where a lot of it was shelfware, the things that you could buy from suppliers, compared to the Norwegian stuff, which was handmade for their job. So they're ready to go. There's a fully packed Norwegian sledge. In total it was 330 kilos, so 302 kilos of food and supplies, and their sledge was 28 kilos. There are 4 dog teams, each of 13 dogs, in the wide Inuit format, all running at about the same level, not after each other as the other dogs do. Some of the depot markings on the way. Crossing a dangerous ridge, the Devil's Ballroom. Here they passed Shackleton's record. It's like 97 English miles from the pole. They put up the flag. And this is a very interesting photo because they're coming to the depots with the paraffin and they see that there's some leakage. So they brought equipment to fix the leak. So they had this heating lamp and silver coins. So on the way, to avoid them losing paraffin when they come back, they fixed the edges of the paraffin cans on the way and on the way back. So it's a very simple technique, but at least they thought of it. And when you think that Scott probably died because they did not get enough water, because on several of the depots that they came to, all the paraffin were lost. They could not get the food. They couldn't cook the food, they couldn't get the water they needed. So paraffin is extremely important on a polar expedition. So when you don't have it, it could be lethal. And it was probably one of the main reasons why Scott's team didn't make it back. They're getting closer to the South Pole. Here you have the new 5-man tent after I remodeled the 3-man tent. The day before they get to the pole, and Bjørland is writing some interesting things in his diary, that I can hear the earth axles squeak, but tomorrow we will oil it. But all of them are very afraid that they will not be the first, and the whole thing has been for nothing. So, but they got to the pole, and the next day Bjørland writes in his diary, it's nice and flat as the Morgedal Lake, and the skiing is good. And when you know 1 month and 3 days later, the diaries of the British was not very positive about the adventure at all. So they brought this tent. This was not used at the expedition. It was brought to be left at the pole because it was thin silk that it would not last long before it was worn. And they made them the tent on the way down to the South Pole, found out it didn't work, so they only brought it to bring at the pole. They made two. The other one we have in our museum, so it's a nice thing. And just to make sure that they were at the pole, they went 10 miles in each direction from where they calculated it was and put up markers, also again to box in the pole. And of course, when the British came there and also agreed and approved on that location, it's a proof that Amundsen had been there. So here you see the roots of both Scott, Shackleton and Amundsen. And what was interesting, in a lot of the papers said that Amundsen was probably have found the easy way to the South Pole, and that's why he got there first. But when you see the route of Amundsen in blue and Scott in red up the Beardmore Glacier, when you go from 0 to 3,000 meters in such a short period of time that Amundsen did, you don't adapt to the height so well as the English had. So the Norwegians probably had much more headaches and problems in those few days, while the English could carry and up in a higher latitude much slower than the Norwegians did. Norwegians also got higher and then had to went down a little bit before they got into the pole. So you're at the pole, you have to go back, and to tell the story, the first person to tell the story is also a kind of a winner. So then you have to race back, and you could have used a telegram, which was wireless, which was on some ships at the time. But Amundsen didn't want to have wireless in case someone got bad news from home, like a daughter had died, or a son got born, and so on. So it was very important that there was nothing from the outside that could change the motivation of the crew. Then they had to just sail back to civilization as fast as possible. So you have the coming back to the camp. The Fram is there and ready, and they go back to Tasmania. And Amundsen, fresh in mind how he lost all his money from Postal Major Glassford in Minnesota, so he rows alone into Hobart, and he goes to the telegraph station. He sends a telegram in code to Nansen. He go into the hotel room, lock the door, and stay there for 24 hours, and then all the congratulations start to pour in from all over the world. He got his money and could pay the salaries and the costs of the expeditions. So it's a huge amount for this type of rides compared to the total budget. And then you go to Argentina, being celebrated. Amundsen is then doing his lecture tour. Here he's in Oslo talking for 3,000 people without the microphone and using exactly the same photos that you have seen here. So the photos we have seen and the hand-colored ones are digitized from Amundsen's original lantern slides. This is also quite interesting. Here you have Amundsen lecture poster in Britain, and we have found all the communication between the Brits and Amundsen's brother, who was his manager. When Scott comes, you leave. So he was allowed to do the lecture, but when Scott come later, Amundsen would then have to leave the country to give priority to Scott. And it's called How We Reached the South Pole. Not very exciting or dramatic, but when he was touring later in America to 120 different cities, it was the winner of the international race to the southern extremity of the earth. So it's just very different approach on how he could promote himself in England and the US. Because Amundsen did go north. The Fram was in a bad condition, and in 1914 Fram was not used anymore, but he built a new ship, the Maud, and tried to repeat Fram's drift. It didn't work. They did a lot of major science, thank you to the Norwegian scientists, HU Sverdrup. They also did very early flight attempts on this expedition. And in 1925, he flew to 88 degrees in the German Dornier Wall. They wanted to go to the pole, but they had to do emergency landing. And the ice in the Arctic is not as flat as one think. They had to spend 3 weeks trying to make a runway before they barely managed to go back to civilization. And then, of course, Amundsen became the first man over the North Pole as commander and expedition leader of the airship Norge. In 1928, he was searching, helping to search for the Italian Umberto Nobile, who had crashed in the Arctic. And on the way to Spitsbergen from Tromsø, Amundsen and his crew of 6 other men disappeared. So Amundsen probably died on the 18th or the 19th of June 1928. There's no traces of this boat or ship, the flying plane today, but they have found a gas tank from the boat, and it looks like the gas tank have been tried to make into a floating device under the wings. So probably they had to land. The floater under one of the wings had broken off and disappeared, and they tried to make a new one. But that's all we know. And that's my lecture. Thank you.
Well, I can start with questions.
Yes.
Do you keep diaries?
Personally,
Yes.
no.
But I was just thinking whether diaries of the explorers and scientists of today would have this value as they did back then. But I suppose we document ourselves more than we notice online, probably. Is that the audit?
It's interesting, like when blogs and all that disappears, what do historians of the future base their stories on, you know? So, but a lot of these diaries were not meant for the public. Do I feel guilty of exposing it? Not really. It's so amazing. Even like they write about, you know, what happened every single day on these expeditions. And the interesting part is this non-historical value things. You know, some of their repressives, some write like really, really strange things. Like Sverre Hassel, he writes about coming to Antarctica and eating fresh food for the first time, seals. This fresh seal meat makes me strangely aroused. I have ejaculations every day. You know, it's like it's a strange thing to write in a diary, and now it's there for everyone to read. But some families didn't want the diaries to come out, like the Presterud family. They've probably been asked about his diary because this was not all was that great on the expedition. There were some quarrels, some other things as well, and especially the conflict between Amundsen and Johansen, of which Presterud was the cause. And what if he wrote a diary and we get his story of it? And his family, unfortunately, Presterud shot himself in 1927. So his children, I think at the time 8 and 12 or something, they grew up to have a father that didn't want to be a father. So it wasn't much talked about, and all his papers and the diary was in a box. Nobody in the family looked at it and so on. And then when we made all these other diaries, I called the daughter of, the wife of his son. His son was dead. Is there a diary? Is there a diary? And for a long time, and I said, well, I'd like to come and visit you anyway and tell you what we're doing and how we want to make this new museum not only about Nansen and Amundsen and Sverdrup, but all the men. And then, okay, we set this time, and then when I got there, she had gotten into the basement and picked up the box, and there was the diary and all the other papers and letters, and said, you can have it. And from being a man that nobody in the family talked about, now all of them have read the diary. All of them have the diary. He's now grandfather and great-grandfather again. And before these diaries, he was just someone. So it has, I think it's important that everyone gets credit that took part of it, and especially a lot of people comes to the museum. And my great-grandfather was on the Fram, and the whole school says, no, he wasn't, you know. And then, yes, now you can go into the museum, you see his picture, and there's a small story of what they did before they were on the Fram and after they've been on the Fram. And it will take me 20 more years to publish all these diaries, but there's 60 more. It's all of Nansen's diaries and Nansen's crew, Sverdrup's diaries and Sverdrup's crew. And some of these are amazingly written, like Johansen's diary from the South Pole and the North Pole. He writes like a poet, you know. And some are very simple, and but still have some pieces of information that's interesting.
Has there been anything so surprising that you have had to reevaluate your opinions?
I know that there's so much written against Amundsen that is not true. And there's been, I give a few examples. Johansen was fired, they write. In the diaries, he begged to leave. He did not want to continue the expedition and go to Argentina. He wanted to go home from Hobart. And Hassel writes he probably will be allowed. A biography states also about Johansen, a biographer called Ragnar Kvam. He's written a book about Johansen. And he writes, after the South Pole, everyone is lined up at the castle, and the king goes from person to person and put the medal on everyone's chest, and the only one who's not there is Johansen. We have the signature of everyone who received the medal, including Johansen, but very few people were there because they lived in northern Norway. They were not there. The Navy people, they were on ships somewhere. There was very few people at that time getting the medal. The others got it by mail or other things, and they signed so on. So just full of false information. Bjorland, this conflict with Amundsen and Johansen is very well described in the diaries from Amundsen's side and Johansen's side, and both are very sad. And Bjorland writes, what's the story? This is no deal, this is no issue. We learned so much from this false start. So historians and biographers just want to make this huge thing about this conflict. And in this exhibition, it says that Amundsen left first after the first start and left the others back home and to find their own way. The true story is there were 3 people that had frostbites.
It was the head start they had, when they started.
The false start they had started.
And then they had to
there were
go
3
back
people.
before
The 3 people that had frostbite was Stubberud and Hansen and Prestrud. But Prestrud, he didn't tell anyone that he had frostbites. He was cold. He hated it. He was afraid of being left out of the polar team. He didn't say. But Stubberud and Hansen said Amundsen put those 2 on his sledge and got them back as soon as possible. The others found their way, as you normally did after the depot expedition. If Prestrud had said he had frostbites, he would have been back first. And that's very clear in the diaries. So, and they choose to leave that out when you write a biography. And they've chosen to do that here, you know. So it's...
Makes us wonder what people will write about us in the future. Maybe you have any more questions?
I think I understood really the ship Fram
it was created by Nansen, and initial drawings, and but the Norwegian government paid for much of it. So after the Fram expedition, it belonged to the Norwegian government. In 1914, it was put, after the 3 expeditions, it was in bad shape. And then in the 20s, the government wanted to burn her because it wasted space in the Navy harbor. And then a few people, some explorers and some wealthy and important Norwegian, started the committee to preserve the polar ship Fram and got the Fram from the government. And then they spent 5 years getting money privately to restore the ship, and then 5 more years to build our museum. So the Fram belongs to the museum.
So, as I just heard a little bit before, the Norwegian crown is quite low right now. It's very good time to go and see the Fram in the museum in Oslo. Maybe I have, if you don't have any more questions, you can have one more. You have? No? I have one short question. Did Amundsen have any bad habits? Like, so far I've read from both sides, and I understand how British like to make him seem very serious, and how Norwegians show his strengths. But from your side, did he have any bad habits or anything?
Oh, he was also stubborn. You know, he paid for all of this. He had the better idea, and his way was implemented to begin with. And if it didn't work, they had to implement some of the other guys' ideas. But at least they changed it. And but what he really did, he loved being in the polar regions, and he even writes lyrical about seeing the southern lights. And I think he was at his most happiest in the Northwest Passage and also in the Antarctic, preparing for his expeditions, because he's so proud of his men, and he wrote so well about his men. And Lindström, he thought, was the greatest gift to polar exploration, because he was not only a cook, but he also could fix with his short, stubby hands. He could fix all technological instruments that went to pieces. Like one of these automatic register things for temperature and air pressure didn't work, so he took a tin can and put the tin can instead of the roller, and then, since it was not exactly the same size, he changed the speed, so so it's kind of, yeah. But of course, he was probably a vain man, Amundsen. He didn't like the public. He preferred to be himself, alone. He lived quite in a place where you don't pass. So he just wanted to be on expeditions, and I think for a lot of his men, he was one of the guys, and there was no doubt that he was the boss. And it's very interesting to see from the diaries, because some of them are really angry with Amundsen during the expeditions. And I think at one time, they suddenly understand, if this man had not whipped us to the pole, we would never have gone there. You know, they were hired help. And Hustle, his diary is so negative. Every single page is about Amundsen, about all the other officers, about all the other men. He's negative about everything. And he becomes one of Amundsen's best friends and dies Amundsen's garden, so who knows, you quarrel at home because you don't put your seat down on the toilet. What you do when you are thousands and thousands of miles from home with the same guys every morning, you have to let up steam. So diaries could be dangerous, because some people only see one sentence. Oh my God, that's horrible. But if you read all of them, and from all angles and at different times, when you're in good mood and bad mood, I guess in your head you start off developing a picture, which is, maybe that's the way it is. I think that of all these diaries I've read, there's 2 that stands out. One is Amundsen's diary from the Northwest Passage. It's so interesting. And the way they interact with the Inuit is amazing, and how they've catalogued everything the Inuit do. But also Nansen's diary, from Fram. It's going to be a thick book. He writes like a professional author just in his diary. Like he's reindeer hunting and it's so exciting, like you have to go from page to page, and he's so depressed on a large part of the expedition. He's so depressed, he misses his family so much, and all of this is information that's never published, because he couldn't publish these things when he wrote his famous book. So I really look forward to publish that. So it's amazing writing.
Does your museum have an internet shop where we can all order your books if anyone is interested now?
Norway, the Norwegian postal system have destroyed internet shopping to Norway. It's so expensive. Like we're now selling Amundsen's diary for €8, and it would be €30 to ship it. You know, so it's.
So we have to come.
You have to come, or you gather a lot of people together and then you do one large shipment.
There was a question here.
You said that Amundsen comes from a family of sailors. Whatever happened to all these sailors? So that
I haven't. His father and great-father had a shipping company based in Fredrikstad. So they owned the ships. They did trips to Asia and different places. I don't know, but I guess it was sold out. Two of his brothers were. One of his brother were not in the shipping. So my guess is that they sold it out at some stage. I don't know.
But they were never of any real assistance to Roald Amundsen in
His brother Leon was his best friend, and his lawyer and his business partner. So he even cashed in his life insurance to help pay for the Northwest Passage expeditions. His other brother also gave something, but it was mainly his brother Leon. They were close about everything until about 1925-26. They had a serious quarrel, and they were probably not on good terms the last 2 years of Amundsen's life.
But they were not adventurous.
No.
As the
No, they were more in business, and he didn't have his father, I think, as a sea captain, being part of somebody tried mutiny on his ship and so on. So he was probably a tough guy, like the Norwegian sailors were. You know, you risk all your money, and then wherever you did the transportation, most of your fortune was on that ship. And if the ship would sink, you lost your property as well. So it's tough business.
A couple of days ago there was a documentary in Estonian TV made by Brits, I think, about this race. And there Borge Osland said that in Norwegian public mind there is kind of like shadow of Amundsen. What did it mean?
Because it started in the 60s about writing biographies of Amundsen. I was really a nasty man. And then the next 3 big sellers are very negative about Amundsen. And even a guy called Tor Boman Larsen, he writes about Amundsen, but they don't, like his 3 main girlfriends were all married. You know, there's several things that in his life that are not considered ethical or social and so on, but that gets the media. Whenever you have some shit on Amundsen from a letter or something, big stories in Norwegian papers. Like when we launched all these diaries, 15 diaries, which are amazing. We spent years on them. The headline in the Norwegian paper Aftenposten, "Diaries proves Amundsen was difficult to work with." They hadn't read any of them. You know, they just found one sentence in one diary and they didn't care about the rest. So that's how, when you talk about Nansen, you know, don't touch a hair on that man's head. He's our national hero. It just happened to be that way. And the book about Hjalmar Johansen, he wants to make Johansen a hero, but stepping on Nansen and Johansen. And in my opinion, you can make someone a hero without trying to destroy anyone else. There's room for all of them. Johansen and Nansen and Amundsen and Prestrud and Nilsen, all of them can be heroes. You don't have to make someone better than the others. And if one even think that Johansen could have organized any of this expedition, they're completely wrong. So they were special people. Amundsen was by far the better polar explorer than Nansen. Nansen was more important for Norway over many years. But even Nansen was very, what's the word? He thought Amundsen was amazing. When you see Nansen's letters about what Amundsen did in the Northwest Passage, Nansen was in awe. You know, this is remarkable. And when you go somewhere where people have tried for 400 years, and in 1901, Amundsen put his plan in writing in a lecture. I'm going there and spending 2 years there. Then I continue and we're 1 winter there. And we're talking about an area where nobody have managed to go through. And he do exactly that. He went exactly there. He spent 2 years exactly there. A 3rd year exactly there. And he did his science and he found the Northwest Passage and he came back alive. It's quite incredible. So, but as you heard, his physical lessons from the Northwest Passage, what he experienced on his physical self, that was made the South Pole expedition so easy. Like, it was a long ski journey, some people say, and it was, of course, they underwrite in the diary the danger. You fell down a crevice, you know, you are helped by the others to get up, and they were tiring, and Wisting, one of the men, probably destroyed his heart because of the strain. But still, you walked there and you walked back like sailors at the time did. You know, you left your home and family for 2 years, then you come back, you were there for the summer and you left for 2 more years. That's the life. But what's interesting also is that none of the Norwegians became anything after the expeditions. Like now, they would have been part of Big Brother and Dancing with the Stars and everything. But they went from being a sailor to a sailor. If you were a Navy officer, you went back to the Navy. If you were a lighthouse keeper, you went back to the lighthouse. And they remained that way till they died.
It seems they love their jobs.
Yeah, I think so.
Even more than polar explorations, maybe. So I'm really happy and grateful to have you here, and we have a small present, and I think you deserve a few more claps from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you.